once asked a famous ghost hunter what his scariest moment was. This is his story. Back when I was in college, the Student Campus Activity Council hired a famous ghost hunter to come speak at our school. I've always loved the paranormal, so I left my skeptical boyfriend behind in his dorm and hightailed it over to the auditorium. The ghost hunter was someone I'd never heard of, but he had an impressive background and seemed to have several things in the works at the time. This was in 2005. I think he actually might have a TV show now. He was a man of small stature with a little white professor's beard and a receding hairline, but the way he spoke about the afterlife was fascinating. You could tell he truly believed what he claimed to see. Either that, or he was a hell of a salesman. He had us hanging on every word. We watched some interesting video clips of his investigations. He had a nice collection of photos and scary stories to go with them. I remember one about a haunted doll that he said moved freely around the room of the person who had picked it up at a flea market, just not when anyone was around to witness it. Towards the end, he opened up the floor for questions. There were your typical dumbass college kid questions. Have you ever seen someone's head spin around like The Exorcist? Stuff like that. And a few that were pretty interesting. I decided I wasn't going to let this opportunity to speak to someone so apparently revered in the field of the supernatural slip away, so I raised my hand. The ghost hunter spotted me, pointed, and smiled. "Yes, you, the girl in the white shirt?" "Yeah, I said, and I know I sounded nervous because I felt so dumb for sounding so nervous. I was just wondering, what's the scariest thing you can remember from your career as a ghost hunter?" I was halfway back in the auditorium, quite a distance from the stage, but I saw his face fall. I know I did. "Well," he said, forcing a tight little laugh. It was forced, I know it was. There are so many scary moments to recall. They tend to pop up quite often when you're in my line of work. This got a little chuckle from the audience. I suddenly felt pretty stupid for asking the question at all. He proceeded to tell some story about tracking a poltergeist in an abandoned elementary school and his flashlight failing. I remember because it really wasn't very scary. At least it didn't seem that way for someone who hunts ghosts for a living. He moved on from the story and answered a few more questions. He didn't look my way again. When it was over and everyone started to leave, I decided not to get stuck in the crush of students leaving through the front door. Feeling somewhat dejected, like I had done something wrong, I slipped quietly out the theater exit and headed for my dorm. The ghost hunter was sitting outside on a bench near the bike rack smoking a cigarette. I ducked my head and tried to get by without him noticing. "Hey, kid." He took another drag and crushed the cigarette out on the cement bench beside him. "Listen, I'm sorry," I remember blurting, feeling like such a stupid little girl. "I know my question was dumb. I wasn't trying to make fun of you or anything." He shook his head. He brushed the ashes off the bench. He patted the space beside him, inviting me to sit. I hesitated. And this could definitely be a case of stranger danger, just like they taught in the intro to university classes. Then sat down, keeping a healthy distance between us. He was old, I was young. I could probably outrun the guy. Or who knows, maybe I was just as stupid as I felt. "I didn't tell the truth," the ghost hunter said. His face looked much older close up, the wrinkles deeper. The confident salesman aura had faded from him, leaving behind a man in his 60s who had clearly seen a lot of things. That story I told. It wasn't the scariest moment of my career. "I know," I remember saying. He nodded as though he had known I knew. "This is the scariest moment of my career," he said. And this is what he told me. It was the 1970s. I was a much younger man. I hadn't reached success in the paranormal industry quite yet, and was left to pick up the scraps that the pros didn't want. Usually they were schizophrenics whose broken minds tricked them into believing there were phantoms after them, or children playing pranks on gullible and concerned members of the neighborhood. If anything, it was a simple cleansing of the home with sage, and off I went. When I first got the call, I was ecstatic. What the client was describing appeared to be a full-blown demonic haunting, complete with physical manifestations, possession, and multiple witnesses. It was the break I was searching for. It was the break I needed. The only detail that truly worried me was that their teenage son, the person they claimed to be suffering from possession, had become violent with members of his family. Up until recently, he'd only acted out of character. However, a week prior, he had tried to rape his older female cousin. She was shaken, but mostly unharmed. The family sent her to live elsewhere until it could all be figured out. Therefore, when I headed out to their home, I made sure to arrive fully prepared. I brought holy water, crucifixes, sage, and, just for good measure, a small loaded handgun. I knew it wouldn't come to that, but something about the mother's frantic tone over the phone told me it was just a good idea. I wish I could say the visit itself was exciting. Unfortunately, from the moment I pulled into the driveway of the beautiful remodeled Victorian, all activity seemed to stop. That is if it was ever there to begin with. I spent 2 weeks investigating the home. I used equipment considered very technologically advanced for the era. I studied energy waves. I interviewed the son whose family claimed to be possessed, when in fact, he just seemed to be depressed, perhaps psychologically disturbed. I recommended a therapist, a renowned child psychologist who was famous for his work with violent young men. On my last day in the house, they took him into the city for treatment. His parents returned shortly before midnight, retiring wearily to their bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen to go over my findings. There was nothing to be said, and I knew it. Everything they'd described could be written off to the hysterics of a family who couldn't admit that their son was in desperate need of medical attention. Everything, that is, except for the drains in the floor. Upon touring the home, I was impressed with how up-to-date it had been brought. It was clearly from the early 1900s and kept in immaculate condition. The woodwork and character of the house were carefully preserved as it was given necessary updates like modern plumbing and electricity. The basement was the only area that seemed stuck in time. The walls were a clammy stone that was prone to gathering moisture, leaving it unfit to store anything vulnerable to spiders or mold. The family had left it empty for this reason, and while it certainly felt very spooky to spend any amount of time in the windowless room with the single hanging light and its vast cement floors, I never recorded anything of note in this area. However, there was one thing I couldn't understand. Given the approximate time the home had been built and its presence in a residential neighborhood, there was simply no accounting for the 4 large slotted drains set in the cold concrete floor. As I sat alone in the kitchen, poring over my meager findings, trying to find meaning in all these words, I heard something. It was only a little sound at first, and so I ignored it. But then it came again, louder this time. There was a steep spiral staircase that led to the second floor, winding up from the corner of the small kitchen, and it was where the noise seemed to be coming from. Assuming it was simply one of the homeowners restless after dropping their son off at an institution, I glanced up. It was coming down the stairs. I can't say walking because that wasn't the case. It was just, floating isn't even the right word, just coming down the stairs, straight at me. It had no eyes. It had no face. And yet somehow I knew it was looking at me, right at me, into the very depths of my soul. Then it spoke. I'm not sure how it spoke. I don't think I actually heard anything, so perhaps it used some sort of telepathy. Either way, I can recall the words to this very day. You know what he did to us. I didn't think. I couldn't, I just ran. I upended my chair when I fled, scattering papers across the kitchen that claimed this house wasn't really haunted, it was all the hallucinations of a very sick boy. I left them there. Do you know how awful that is? I left those people in that house with that thing. I didn't stop driving for 30 miles. For God's sake, when I realized how far I'd gone, I finally pulled over and called the family from a payphone. They were the furthest thing from my mind when I saw it. All I could do was respond to the deep animal instinct to escape, to run out of that supposedly safe house with my tail between my legs. They moved, I think. I was unable to continue my investigation. In writing, I cited insufficient evidence, but I knew it was cowardice. I believe the house was leveled a few years later. I ended up doing my own research. Curiosity ate away at me with vicious little rat teeth as time went by. The accusation still ringing fresh in my ears. You know what he did to us. And eventually, yes, I did. Old newspaper clippings didn't tie the stories together, not necessarily, but I was able to piece some meaning out of the yellowed excerpts. At some point around the turn of the century, the house had been the residence to a well-respected mortician. Unable to find a building in town to suit his needs, he said he built his own home at office space. It was a grand feat of architecture and a shining example of a true entrepreneur, a man pursuing the American dream of running his own business. Upstairs, the bedroom. Mid-level, the funeral home. In the basement, a mortuary. I knew what the drains were for. Separately, decades later, another well-respected member of the local community was arrested under the suspicion of abuse of his professional position with moral cause. The newspaper didn't elaborate, probably due to the sensitive nature of the crimes, but his punishment was minor. After a brief stay in the local jail, the perpetrator stripped his home of all its value and left town before trial, never to be seen again. It didn't take much to guess the connection. I suppose I don't know for sure, but the words of that thing still echo through my head to this day. You know what he did to us. There was a reason that morticians felt such a strong desire to build a house that contained their business, to suit his needs. The things that were done to those bodies in the basement were unspeakable. But yes, I know what he did to them, and it's because of this, coming face to face with the true nature of man in its darkest places, that the encounter with that faceless thing is the scariest moment of my career. Because now I know. I still remember his expression, the way all the color dropped out of him as he went on, the white hair of his beard barely distinguishable from his pale skin, the slump of his shoulders, the way his voice shook. I apologized. He waved me off. He left. I felt terrible. I still feel terrible for making him relive that moment. But as I grew up, as campus activities were replaced with bills in my own career, the ghost hunter fell from the forefront of my mind little by little. Until last week when I moved in with my fiancé. When I took the boxes into the basement despite his warnings of spiders and mold. Because there's a large slotted drain in the center of the room. And I'm so worried, so scared about what I might know. I've been blind since I was born. As I grew up, everything was described to me in such vivid detail, I didn't even realize why it was that important to see, especially having no reference point to compare it. We lived on a single-floor ranch house, that's what Father told me. In my mind, I could see, of course, although unlike how a sighted person could. I had spatial awareness. I knew where my bedroom was, the bathroom, the living room, and the kitchen. Each wall had its own texture. I don't know if that was done on purpose, or that I could feel things others never noticed. I rarely fell over, only if Father or one of the visitors put something somewhere they shouldn't. It was usually the visitors, and Dad would shout. They visited infrequently, though not for long. Father said I shouldn't speak to them, that it unsettled him. He'd worry when I saw something he didn't. Ellie was the first. She seemed very sweet. She asked me my name and why my face was so messed up. She was in the living room. I could hear where she sat from her breaths. Harsh nasal sounds, as if her nose was blocked. When Father had a cold, he'd always breathe through his mouth big breaths as he wasn't used to it. When people mentioned my face, I always touched it, trying to work out why it was so strange to them. When I asked if I could touch theirs, there was always a pause. I guess sighted people never did that, so why would they need to? When I asked Ellie if I could touch her face, she reluctantly agreed. But moments later, Father entered the room and asked me who I was speaking to. I told him nobody. He would always punish me when I spoke about them. I think it scared him. He'd take my arm and march me off. I'd be knocked off balance and disoriented to the point where when he finally set me down, my hands would frantically search my surroundings until I knew where I was. It was usually my bedroom. Every now and then, he'd leave me outside in the middle of nowhere. That was the worst. I would be lost and scared. He told me about the road that ran in front of the house, and the sounds I heard were cars. They'd kill me if they touched me. Those sounds were all I had to know where I was. I waited to hear. Then I knew which way to run back to the house. I heard Ellie that evening. She whispered to me, saying she was scared. I'd whisper back, but she didn't hear. I asked the father about Ellie. He didn't want to talk about her. I asked him why. He didn't reply. When I told him that she asked about my face, he asked me what I did. I told him I wanted to touch hers. He laughed, though I knew he wasn't happy. I could hear the difference. When you laugh for pleasure, your mouth is wide open. When you pretend, your mouth is almost closed. To me, the difference is obvious. It wasn't until I was older that he explained. He said we lived in a special place, connected to the other world. Sometimes dead people slip through, people who die in pain and want to reach the living. He explained that because I couldn't see, I was able to tune into that. That they knew I was listening when others weren't. He said I had to ignore it. Otherwise, they'd latch onto me and never leave me, and all the dead want is to be alive again. It was dangerous. They would trick me. He said he knew how to deal with them, but he couldn't help me if they became attached to me. Alex appeared to me a few years later. She told me she was lost and didn't know where she was. I told her I wasn't allowed to speak to her, but she pleaded for help. I kept quiet, knowing what would happen if I said anything. "Did you speak to them?" Father asked. Though I was upset, I told him no. I wished I could help her. I knew what it was like to be lost, and it scared me. Alex didn't whisper to me at all. I'd ignored her, and she ignored me. Father saved me. I was thankful. After Alex, I knew what I needed to do, so I did it. They stopped bothering me after that for a very long time. That was until Sarah appeared. Sarah didn't give me a chance to be quiet. I was on my own, sitting in the living room and listening to the television. "Help," she said. "I need to find a way out." I stayed silent. "You can hear me, can't you?" she said, surprised. "I'm not allowed to speak to you," I told her. "Please," she begged. "I'm scared. I'm lost. I want to see my daddy." I gripped the arms of the chair, telling her I wasn't allowed. "He's dead," she said, and I didn't answer. "Your father is dead," she said again. I wasn't going to fall for it. I heard banging from around the room as things began to fly and the shelves began to shake. "Stop it," I shouted, and it did. "Please help me leave," she said. I wasn't going to talk to her. I did the only thing I thought would help. I unlocked the front door, hoping she'd run out and get lost, just like I would do. When I heard from her no more, I locked the door and sat back down. I listened intently for any signs she was still there. Except for the sounds of the TV, it was silent. I hated when my heart raced. I became all too aware of the tick-tock feeling rise and fall within my chest like it was about to explode. When I heard my father's voice, I screamed. "Son," he said, "I need your help. I think I'm dying." I did what he told me to do. I didn't speak. If he did die, he'd never leave me. Instead, I raced out into the open air and shouted for help. I shouted until my voice was hoarse. I heard the sounds of cars that raced along the road in front of my house. I shouted until I heard someone respond. It was a woman. "What's wrong?" they asked. I told them I thought my father was dying. They asked what had happened to my face. I pleaded with them for help, and they promised they would. Sometime later, the woman returned to me. I was sitting on the grass. She asked if she could hold my hand. "I'm so sorry," she told me. I heard the sounds of sirens and the sounds of people rushing. I asked what was going on. The woman said she was there for me. As the noise died down, a man asked me a question. "I'm a paramedic," he said. "What happened to your face?" I told him I was fine. He asked if I was sure, and I told him I was. He asked if I minded him touching my face. I said it was okay. I screamed and asked what he was doing. He told me everything was going to be okay, and the woman squeezed my hand, saying to be brave. I felt a pressure release from around my forehead, and the air felt cold against my skin. It sounded as if he were peeling an orange. That's how I imagined that in my head and worried he'd expose my insides. I didn't know what it was I was experiencing. I felt a tight pain within my head, like when you kick your shin against something hard, and then something I've come to understand as bright. It hurt so much I began to cry. "What happened to your eyes?" the paramedic asked. I said I was blind. He asked to check them. The pain returned when he examined them. "Do you know him?" he asked. The woman told him I was screaming for help and she came. She didn't know me. "How long have you had the eye injury?" he asked. I told him I was blind from birth. He asked me if I could see his fingers. I told him no. He asked if I could open my eyes. I didn't respond. I felt his fingers on my face, fingers covered in something rubbery. Then the brightness again. I screamed. He tried to calm me. I didn't know what was going on. Things I couldn't describe came to me. It was like it always was, but 100-fold, so much more real. I carried on screaming as a fuzzy form came into view. "Just breathe. Okay, everything will be fine." "When was the last time you saw?" the paramedic asked. As my heart began to calm and my breathing slowed, I was distracted by what I was experiencing. It overwhelmed me. I wanted to cry, and I did. "How long has it been?" he asked again. "I've never seen anything before," I told him. I was told to keep the eye mask on for most of the day, only taking it off at night at first to allow my eyes to adjust. I'd been staying with my uncle and aunt I didn't even know I had. They were shocked at what happened to me and that I hadn't been to school. It's been a roller coaster ride. The doctor said I may never get perfect vision, though I will take what little vision I have. It's a godsend. I've been learning to read and write for the past few years. I've been asking my aunt what happened to my father, but all she says is he died of a heart attack. I asked what type of man he was. She says he was her brother, and she'll love him no matter what. My uncle doesn't want to talk about him at all. I've been using the computer a lot recently and really enjoying the internet. I can't believe there is such a thing. After being so lonely for so long, I can talk to whoever I want, when I want. How do I know if who I'm speaking to is alive? No one seems to worry about that, like Father did. Someone asked me today who I was. I was on a forum talking about the spirit world. I was so happy to find people who I could relate to. They sent me a link. They asked if I was the same person. It was an article on a true crime website. It was about my dad. They mentioned me by name, that I was bound so I couldn't see, that my mother had gone missing soon after my birth, that my father always wanted a daughter. They found 14 bodies in the basement. They said one got away, a girl by the name of Sarah Frank. She was the one to call the police. They supposed he parked the car around the back of the house. That's where they found it. He carried them into the basement via the storm entrance, where he'd left them. Sarah had managed to get away after she agreed to be his daughter following 4 days of sustained torture. She then stabbed him with a kitchen knife he'd placed on the counter to butter some toast. I didn't want to believe it. And I am not sure I would have if it weren't for the names. Two stuck out, Ellie Farmer and Alex Riddle. But I'd spoken to them. Did I speak to them before or after he killed them? To this day, I wonder if my father was honest with me about one thing in his life.